So we are on exactly 15 minutes past the hour.
Yeah.
So good morning to everyone. Welcome to our lecture series with President Ilves. So my name is Robert Krimmer. I'm Professor of E-Governance at the Schutte Institute, located within the Center for IT Impact Studies, Cities. And it's a particular honor to welcome you all here. So we have a really nice turnout for our talk. So already 50 and more participants, and more are coming in as we speak. So it's really interesting, and we're going to expect an interesting discussion. So it's also particularly nice to do this talking series as part of the Politics and Democracy in the Digital Age Master Program that we have revamped and are revamping for our institute. So to really strengthen also the focus on the one hand side on politics and governance, and under this digital transfer, or during this digital transformation that we're currently undergoing. And that's also a bit of the theme that you will hear reflected during this 4-part lecture series with our former president, that will be talking about democracy, about security, and the threats that come from that. So it will be a particular interesting talk. I don't think I need to introduce Toomas Hendrik Ilves much. I think he's well known in Estonia and beyond as one of the forethinkers around digital transformation when it comes to the diplomacy, but also to the state level. He has been setting the trends quite a bit in the world, and actually motivated many countries to follow suit to Estonia's great pursuit over the last 25 years. And similarly, he has recently held an appointment to Stanford University, and we're very proud to welcome him now here at the University of Tartu. And thanks also to Vice Rector Christian Vassil for facilitating that for us here at the department, together with our newly founded ERA chair on e-governance and digital public services, in which context we're having this guest professorship for President Ilves. And before we start with the lecture, I just want to give some housekeeping rules. So you probably have noticed that on the top right it says recording. So we are recording the lecture. But for the questions that you will have, so we will ask you very actively to discuss and to think about the lecture. So you can already put during the presentation your questions into the chat, and we'll be calling you afterwards, but there will also be the possibility to have your questions and discuss in the open forum after the presentation, which will last plus minus 60 minutes. And then we have the remaining time for the discussion afterwards. Yeah, President Ilves, without further ado, I would like to invite you to the stage and take over.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just warning you ahead that I may go considerably over 60 minutes, but
that's well you for you. Or
we can have a tutorial afterwards if you want.
Exactly.
Okay, I mean the entire lecture series really has to do with digitization and governance, and I would start off by just saying that we are amidst the greatest transformation that mankind has been in since, I mean, we can compare it to the steam engine and the printing press and maybe the wheel. With the digitization of all aspects of our lives in the past 25 years, with smartphones, laptops, with apps for every conceivable service, we have become used to living in a digital environment. As social beings, our relationships, our social circles, our political views, during COVID-19, how we meet and talk to one another and how we get our food, indeed almost all communications have been transformed by digitization, from Tinder to Airbnb to Zoom, to restaurant deliveries, to laundry services. There is no service that does not exist in app form, except generally our governance. I mean, there are exceptions, and we who are in Estonia live in one of those, but there are not many. And so I'm going to look at how governance has changed and how it's not changed amidst the greatest technological transformation ever. Or if we rate the invention of the wheel, the printing press, or the steam engine as having a greater influence in the long term, which they probably do, consider that in cultural Europe, literacy became near universal only 400 years after the invention of the printing press, with all the changes in the internet and the technology for the internet. The hypertext transfer protocol, which is the basis of the internet, was only 31 years old, and only, I guess, so only 29 years old is the first commercial web browser, which you had to buy in a store. If you're from the US and you're old enough, it was Radio Shack, and you had to upload the first web browser for $29.95. And the smartphone allowing you to connect to the internet anywhere in the world is only 15 years old. So I'm going to talk about three different aspects of governance: services, or what governance does; security, which is how basically the government fulfills its most important task, making sure you and your country survives; and democracy, which for this part of the world, that the remaining part of the world that chooses, where people choose its government, make sure, and democracy, which ensures respect for human rights, rule of law, and peaceful transfer of power through free and fair elections, has come under considerable threat. And these various themes will crisscross through the lectures as they touch upon the others. As with the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, the development of a new transformative technology, in this case, information technology, the internet, is reordering the fundamental assumptions of humanity. Of course, the benefits of internetization have been myriad. Yet, as the invention of the printing press also led to the end of medieval Catholic Europe, and included proportionally the bloodiest, most costly war in the 30 Years' War. I mean, proportionally, still after World War I and World War II, not that many people have been killed in Europe as the 30 Years' War. It was the first ideological war. I mean, before that, I mean, you were going after territory, but this was ideological war, and people were motivated to go to war to kill the other person because they believed something else. And the differences if you think of sort of Freud's narcissism of small differences, I mean, religion as an ideology has always been one of those areas where people go really get into the narcissism of small differences. I mean, if you think back to the Albigensian heresy, I mean, there was an entire, I mean, thousands of people were simply wiped out because they had a different view of the Bible, not very different. But it also led to the rise of science and the Enlightenment, and in the same way, I would say that digital technology threatens at this point to undermine the most crucial part of Enlightenment, which is liberal democracy, running the gamut from hacking politicians' servers to doxing their mails, from fake news to increasing polarization through echo chambers and algorithmic progressions of extremist content to granularly targeted advertising. The digital era has actually undermined democratic processes and social coherence to a degree the modern era has never mentioned. Moreover, and perhaps most scariest to me, is that dramatic increases in computing power offer, for the first time since the 18th century, alternatives in authoritarian regimes that are a realistically viable alternative to liberal democracy and far more dystopian than the vision of 1984. One thing I say is that we can't predict where it's going either. No one would have predicted that 2016 we would have our digital technology would be undermining referenda in the Netherlands, referenda in the UK, the elections in the US, that there would be a serious attempt to change the election or to manipulate the elections in France in 2017. I mean, this was not foreseen. We had an altogether different view of the internet as something benign and wonderful. Nonetheless, I mean, basically, it's going to, I mean, there's nothing that's going to stop digitization, or even if it's stopped right now, we'd be in a mess, but it's not going to stop. So with this range of digital disruptors threatening democratic assumptions, no single approach to dealing with this era will work. Each of these problems I just enumerated will require its own solutions, and they will require legal solutions. I mean, the law will be able to regulate this, nothing else. So when responsibility for the disruption or the social and political disruption lies across a number of domains and players, from nation states to large corporations, as well as political parties and independent actors, these are often simply lumped together as all one thing, the digital influences, that produce little in the way of meaningful or useful solutions or even perspectives on how to move forward. All the while, throughout all of these dramatic transformations, governance and administration has basically remained impervious to the revolution of the past 20 to 30 years. I mean, Estonia is one of the countries that's an exception, maybe Denmark, Netherlands, Singapore, and others are moving quickly. But we'll see in most countries, there may be one or two digital services or certain things that do the work of governance, but they are generally clunky. And in the United States, where I had a lot of experience with all of this, they rarely work well. But yet with every passing year, the chasm between the instantaneous services we have come to expect from using our screens and the plodding, grinding routine of filling out government forms, standing in line, waiting for a seemingly vast bureaucracy, this chasm becomes ever wider and greater and deeper. And as a contrast, I would just bring out this example from my experience in Silicon Valley, where I lived for 3.5 years, and virtually at ground zero at Stanford. And where I was in what is considered the Mecca of IT, Silicon Valley. In a 12-kilometer, or for those of you from elsewhere, a 10-mile radius of where I lived, you would find the headquarters of Tesla, Apple, Google, Facebook, Palantir, and YouTube, which probably in that small area produces some major amount of GDP of the world. And who knows how many other lesser unicorns were there. Yet, when I wanted to register my child to go to school, the school that the Steve Jobs kids went to, which is just the Palo Alto public school system, I had to drive down to the Palo Alto School District head office, stand in line, show a photocopy of my electricity bill in order to prove that I live in the school district and therefore pay taxes and thus I'm entitled to go to school there. Then an official, once I got through the line, copied out by hand my address and phone number, my daughter's name, date of birth, and then my data from my passport, visa, and my DES 2019 form that says I'm a visiting professor. And then the same thing all over again for my wife, her passport, her visa, and DS 2019. And I won't even go into what it takes to register a car or apply for a driver's license in California's notorious Department of Motor Vehicles. And these issues repeat over and over for citizens and residents, not only there, but everywhere in the United States with local, state, and federal bureaucracies. So in this regard, while it is the capital, the mecca of IT, and I don't even get into the financing side of it, which all of the private equity companies that are there giving money, investing money, that Silicon Valley actually differs very little from developing countries that I have visited, where I've been invited to speak about digitizing governments. But the products produced by Silicon Valley are, of course, available to everyone around the world. So this contrast is especially glaring. And the question that keeps coming up is, why don't we do what Apple, Google, Facebook do for everything else? Why don't we do it for anything related to governance? And the point is, it doesn't have to be this way. And there are places where it isn't. So if there's any realm of human existence since the emergence of organized societies, which has changed the least compared to everything else, and that would benefit the most from digitization as private and commercial sectors leap ahead in quality of service, that area is governance. So what is different about governance? What makes it different from all of these wonderful, why is it that governance is so difficult to apply all these wonderful things or technologies, while where it's not for the private sector? Well, you could say governance is different from the private sector. They had different goals and ways of operating. Obviously, in governance, there is the absence of a profit motive. There is no competition in the public sector. There is no motivation to do things better, to get more money. And indeed, in governance, we have the opposite motivation. It's always been done that way, or the way we do it. It worked. And if you do it differently in a new way, you as a politician might fail and you will get in trouble. Others say it's the nature of governance and bureaucracy, that they cannot be digitized. This, by the way, is the most ridiculous statement I've heard, but I've heard it a lot, and also in government, the US government. The real impediments I concluded are some of the following. First of all, there's the failure to see government as a service. This is a transformation in thinking, that governance is not something you just do and has always been done, but in fact, it is a service. The problem is that service does not have competition. Another major area of concern is that public and the political classes, or political elites' assumptions of what government services entail, which is mainly violations of privacy and surveillance, that immediately takes you to like kind of a digital version of Godwin's law. How many steps does it take to get to 1984, as opposed to how many steps does it take in a web discussion to get to Adolf Hitler? But it's more or less the same. It always comes down to 1984. And these are political problems that we need to deal with. But I think there's a more fundamental problem, which is an amazing intellectual gap between technology and governance. Technology, or to put it a little more specifically, it is technology, science, and profit versus ethics, knowledge, and law, in any order you want there. So let me say, I think that the most intractable is the last issue. A general understanding of the role of government and issues such as privacy and surveillance and what the government knows, or what I call the 1984 problem. But we can deal with the 1984 problem. We can just explain it, but we can deal with privacy. We can find technological solutions and have found technological solutions. But the real problem comes down to something else, which is this fundamental divide in society. And it's not 50-50. The problem, I think, is that we have seen a steady bifurcation or splitting into two of understanding of the world, which has been greatly sped up by the dramatic exponential increase in computing power described by Gordon Moore, co-founder of the chip company Intel. In 1965, he propounded something that, as you might guess, is called Moore's Law, which states that the power of computing doubles roughly every 2 years, but remains at the same cost. It's an empirical law, not a law of physics, but it was one that was observed 56 years ago when Moore came out with it. He thought it would hold for 10 years, but it turns out still to hold. So, which describes in another way how we go from a simple calculator that only added and multiplied, subtracted and divided, that came out in 1965 to just the last 2 years, say a facial recognition IT that can identify a single wanted criminal in a crowd of 60,000 in a Chinese football stadium, or to make a deep fake video of Barack Obama or anyone else doing or saying anything, and you can't tell it's not real. The point, though, is that while undergoing such enormous technological change, the basis of our lives, our laws and regulations have fundamentally not changed. Take the case of internet regulation. Politicians in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere in the liberal democratic world argue about how to apply 19th century and early 20th century antitrust or anti-monopoly legislation to social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter, who in turn use a business model whereas customers don't buy anything, but rather where those companies sell you, your data. You are not, I mean, the basis of antitrust is that there's a monopoly and you have no choice as to where to go, and therefore they can fix prices, but you're not the customer. I mean, other people, you are the product to the other people for whom who are Facebook's customers. Point being that we live legally in a mental framework that says we have to apply the laws that used to exist. I mean, it's kind of curious to my mind, because in fact, there was no anti-monopoly legislation in the era of big oil, of Standard Oil, and of the railroads in Europe and in the United States. So they made up new legislation. We meanwhile here are stuck in 100-year-old legislation on what we do and how we change things. Or partake a more contemporary discussion in the United States, very active, but which is mirrored also in Europe in a slightly different form, but is what is known as Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1996. In that law, the US government, or the Congress, decided that since there's this new little thing called the internet, and we don't want to stymie its growth, we will not hold platforms responsible for their content. We hold television and radio and print media responsible for the content, legally responsible for the content they put in there. But we won't do this to social media because it's just this little industry here that is just beginning, which is a nice idea. However, in 2021, these are the biggest companies in the world. And well, I mean, given all the abuse we have seen, you might think that people say, well, maybe they should be held legally responsible for their content. But we have not solved that. We are stuck in 1996 on the most modern of legislation dealing with the internet. And you see huge amounts of money, lobbying, and probably direct bribes going to keeping it that way because that would reduce the amount of profit. In the EU, it's going in a slightly different direction, which I'm not that much of a fan of, which is that government would start regulating these things. I think that civil suits, tort law should be much more appropriate just to drive the bastards broke if they break the law, frankly. But all right, we'll leave that aside. But as I said, I think that we have entered this place where society has split and bifurcated, where there are two primary modes of understanding the world, one of technology and the other of democratic governance, each with little understanding of the other. This is not a new phenomenon that has just been discovered. It is actually something that has grown out of the university and specialization of knowledge. There's a wonderful essay, which I would recommend if you want to think about these things. Not that wonderful, but at least the first half is pretty good. It's in a 62-year-old essay titled The Two Cultures by C.P. Snow. And if you Google Two Cultures, C.P. Snow, it just comes up. It's public domain and all that. So what he did was he wrote about the university, but that was a small little world compared to this. Snow was one of these rare people already in the middle of the 20th century who straddled two worlds, the culture of science and the culture of the humanities. He was a physical chemist at Cambridge University. I mean, that's pretty hardcore. I mean, you're dealing with quantum mechanics, you know physics and you know chemistry, and it's a rather complex field. But he was also a literary novelist. In fact, he invented the term that we in fact use in Estonian too, and what most people think is a Shakespearean metaphor, which is the corridors of power. He actually wrote a book, The Corridors of Power. That's where the term comes from. And it was a novel. But it's the perfect metaphor for all of the bureaucracies of the 19th and 20th century of governance, be it in Prussia or Russia, the UK or the US. And in that essay, Snow talks about two worlds: the world of the scientists and the world of the people in the humanities. The people in science, he writes, couldn't care less about literary questions and didn't discuss them. They were only interested in science. The literary people were quite curious about science, but they simply did not understand something as complicated as quantum mechanics, mathematics, or science, since they stopped studying any of those subjects in high school. So, the problem that we face is that in the democratic West, in the US and Europe and other liberal democracies, that now science or tech and politics more broadly cannot talk to each other, and they don't understand one another. One group has no interest in the standard ethics and philosophical problems of the past 2,500 years, from Plato and the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. They don't care. I mean, whether you're Bill Gates or you're Mark Zuckerberg, you're proud of the fact that you left Harvard without ever taking a course in ethics, philosophy, or anything else. You just think you're great because you went to Harvard for 2 years and then decided you're going to go make your billions. The difference between C.P. Snow's essay, which was, as I said, about the university, is that back in 1959, and this is where it merges with Moore's law, you didn't really interface with technology. I mean, the most interaction the average person might actually have with technology, other than passively looking at its existence, was to adjust the technology on the timing of your distributor cap. And unless you are my age, you don't even know what a distributor cap is. I doubt any of you do. But I mean, that it was phased out about 35 years ago with fuel injection, but be that as way. Back in 1959, if you had a phone, it was attached to the house. If you left the house, no one knew where you were. No one could listen to you, none of that. But so technologically, we have changed completely. So if you had a landline phone, you couldn't even conceive of the idea of how would it be if you walked around at all times, connected not only to anyone you wanted to call, but in fact, in picture and sound with the world. There was no Google Maps that would tell you where to go, nothing about road conditions. And you could watch television in 1959, but unlike in George Orwell's 1984, it couldn't watch you. I mean, in fact, I remember reading the book. That was one of the things that struck me on the tech side was it would be impossible for the television to look back at you. This is also why I urge all of you to cover the camera on your phone up there, because in fact, it's quite easy to hack into your computer and watch whatever you're doing there. So don't do anything interesting in front of your computer either. And as far as tracking you or listening to your conversations, well, we can basically, I mean, anyone who wants to can basically listen, find out where you are, listen to what you're saying, and this is with with almost everybody in the world has some form of smartphone these days because they've become so cheap. So since 1959, technology has made huge leaps, and only in the past 20 years or so, it's at such a fast clip that we cannot even keep up with it. I mean, to keep in mind that in 1996, which is 25 years ago, the most computerized country in the world by far, at that time, the world leader was the United States. And this is before the phone, before the iPad, about 30% of US households had a computer at home. And they were basically glorified word processing machines at the time. And that was what people used. The people were beginning to use email. And then we had the World Wide Web at its most primitive stage. Where the real change came in was in 2006. First of all, we got the first smartphone. Suddenly you had a mobile, I mean, you had a moving object not connected to anything in a wall except a charge, that gave you access to the entire internet. And then you had, the other thing that happened was Facebook, which basically appeared in 2003 on one university, Harvard, as a dating app. Actually, it was even worse. It was a thing for undergraduate males to rate the looks of women. And then he decided to sort of move beyond. So it was just getting to know people. And then his next step was to take it to Ivy League schools who would then talk to one another, and still mainly as a dating app. And then he opened it up to everyone. The big step, however, was not that you could go on Facebook in your computer, but was with the appearance of mobile phone apps, he put Facebook on your mobile phone. This basically made news instantaneously accessible, mail instantaneously accessible, but it also made fake news, mis and disinformation accessible, and across the globe. It put individual fringe conspiracy theorists, the village idiot in every little village in the world, including our own in Estonia, in touch with other village idiots and fringe conspiracy theorists and crazy people, to the point where, in fact, you can advertise to them, because already several years ago, after the scandals coming out of the advertising used by Donald Trump in his 2016 election campaign, some journalists just put in, I want to see people in the United States who like Hitler, hate Jews, believe in white supremacy, and it found all those people on Facebook, and they didn't tell you who they were, but if you wanted to advertise to reach white supremacists, Nazi anti-Semites, you can make your ad, and Facebook would distribute those ads for you and to each and every person on Facebook who fit that profile. And this is so completely transformed the nature of politics today that I'm not sure how we get out of it. We'll be discussing this in a later date. Today, we'll stick to the sort of fundamental issues. So on the other side, the people who do governance, politicians from presidents down to senators, governors, mayors, Riigikogu members, local town council members, they're like the people that Snow used to drink with after he finished his day in the lab. And they don't basically understand technology. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's changed by now, but at least 5 years ago, it was still the case that there are politicians who would have their emails printed out for them by their secretary. And this is, I mean, in fact, well, this is longer ago, 15 years ago, when I was in the European Parliament, I moved into one office that had no computers. And I said, why are there no computers here? He said, well, the last guy didn't use it. And since already then business was done in the Parliament with computers, I said, well, how would he read all of the emails that he gets only in the European Parliament? He said he had his secretary print them out and he would read them. And then he would dictate to her the answer that she would then type. But, maybe a better example of where we are is that in 2017, when the US Senate woke up to the fact that things were not so good in democracy, and that Facebook had apparently at that time, just apparently played a major role in determining the election, the US Senate called Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg to testify about Facebook using and selling users' data to political parties. And Senator Orrin Hatch, one of the most respected of all senators in the United States, and then chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, obviously one of the most important committees, asked in complete seriousness, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you make your money? Because he didn't understand how it was that Facebook existed. And this also leads to all this sort of, from there on down, we see all kinds of lesser failings, a complete lack of attention to security on the part of government. I think the worst case worldwide that we know of, that where there's public information, because there are all kinds of things we know nothing about, and they're we'll spend a whole lot of time on hacking some other time, another day. But the one we know most about publicly, because it affected so many people publicly, was when it was the 2015 hack of the US Office of Personnel Management. A foreign government, generally is thought to be China, hacked the OPM, or Office of Personnel Management, and siphoned off all of the personal information the government had on 23 million federal employees, including the details of and psychological profiles and evaluations of all CIA employees. So, and they got all of the US military personnel, every single last person. And on top of it all, this was just not a hack, but the government had stored all this information in clear text, meaning exactly in the form that it was written in. It was not encrypted. I mean, this was the US government, which is obsessed with security. And this is after Snowden. But they stored all of that incredibly sensitive information in clear text. There's another side to the ignorance of government as well, which is that in addition to complete disregard for and ignorance of digital matters, there's the overriding paranoia on the part of government leaders who, again, do not understand technology. And this is especially true in Europe, by the way, and was partly why one of the most technologically sophisticated countries in the world, Germany, this area is a complete blind spot or something, and it lags behind most countries in Europe in digitization, out of a fear that it will collect data that can be abused either by the government or a foreign government. I mean, it's basically this is appeal to history. We had the Stasi, we had the Gestapo, we cannot digitize. I mean, this is the answer. I mean, it hasn't really quite collapsed yet, but there will come a time when you can no longer be the technological leader that Germany is without digitization. But these two reasons, I mean, ignorance that leads to data abuse or ignorance that leads to nothing are the primary reasons for lack of progress in digitization, most notably in democracies. I mean, let's face it, authoritarian regimes do not have this problem. They do not have to care about public opinion, right? When was the last time anyone in China cared about public opinion and whether the surveillance that constantly goes on in China is an issue that anyone is willing to say anything about? So, the authoritarian government can and will, decide what data, what emails, what social media posts can be monitored, and they can use the latest artificial intelligence to do that, and it will merely happen. You don't even need people like in the old days with the KGB listening to phone calls. No, you can just monitor it all with AI. So when we look at this, we realize that there is also a fundamental problem between authoritarian and very effective authoritarian regimes and and democracies, where we assume all kinds of safeguards. Now, since I'm in full screen, I can't see what time it is. I have to keep doing. How are we doing on time, Robert?
We're fine.
Yeah.
We're fine. We're about, so 45 minutes in, so.
Okay, well, it's going to go longer. Okay. So where are we today? Well, I think we're on the cusp of a major reordering of the world, unless we start taking taking IT more seriously and as something more than as a great convenience that we now have, and we can, I mean, whatever. If you want to go out on a Friday night, you pull up Tinder. If you want to get something to eat, you type in something for Bolt, and I think that's all wonderful, which is basically how the rest of the world works, and aside from digitized countries. And so out of what we've learned from the past several decades, we know that we have a fundamental problem in getting people, policymakers and lawmakers to understand digital. We have another problem, which I didn't go so much into because I don't even understand the problem, but we do need to figure out a way to get, to either, if in addition to regulating these companies so they don't do these things, maybe do something for the Zuckerbergs and Jack Dorseys and the heads of Palantir to begin to think about the ethics of what they do and what they are doing, how that fits into the society that they themselves depend on to function. After all, it was liberal democracy that allowed them to do the things that they do, yet they are doing something that is destroying liberal democracy, changing our election integrity, removing people's privacy. All of these things also need some kind of deeper thinking on the part of the people who run these companies. We have seen in the last year or so some kind of internal rebellion among Google and Facebook employees, but they usually get fired, so it doesn't go very far. But the need for the people who lead the Western tech firms to understand better the nature of what they are doing and their implications for ethics and for governance is something that is a task. What I'll maybe do right now is we'll take a 5-minute break because I'm going to switch topics and get into the nature of the state, of governance, and what you need to do in order to get there, and then we'll round back to the initial issues. So maybe if we're at a...
So then let's start again at 10 past the hour.
What time is it at the moment?
It's 11:02, and we would start again at 11:10. So that's your 5 minutes, or you want to have more?
That's fine. That's fine. I just need a drink of water and chew some.
Okay. So in the meanwhile, for all the participants, you can basically think through what has been said so far, and then maybe also prepare your questions, and then we start again at 10 past the hour.
All right, I'm going to switch gears now, and I've said a number of times that governance has failed to keep up, but I think we need to look at what governance is, because very little has changed to the fundamentally the way we do governance. But I argue that governance is really so inextricably tied to the nature of the state. So how did the state emerge? Most people actually argue that it was created by war, because in order for the band or group or tribe of people to survive raids and possible annihilation, you needed to protect yourself. It's kind of basic. Or if you, on the other hand, want to acquire the property or territory or of your neighbors, you need to wage war on them. Not that any of these countries, these pre-state societies or democracies, they were more or less kind of like what we see even today in many parts of the world, warlords. I mean, someone like the alpha male in a tribe or in a band of chimpanzees rises to the top, and then he commands everyone else. Or if you're Vladimir Putin or you're Donald Trump, you simply call yourself an alpha male, but that's a different issue. But anyway, so most people actually lived in pre-state societies that were where they were subjected to the will of warlords, where there is no law as we know it, and where there was not in the past. But what do you need to wage war successfully or to defend yourselves? I mean, let's think of this primitive society. Well, I mean, if you're hunter-gatherers, you basically everyone has a commitment to go out and defend the wherever your camp or wherever you live. But and you have the division of labor at that time, according to most anthropologists, is that men hunt mastodons and mammoths and drag them back to the home, while women take care of children and gather nuts and berries, and that's why they're called hunters and gatherers. But once you discover agriculture, you have, which is a full-time occupation, you have some people in society who need to plant, and you need some people who do the guarding. So this is called division of labor. I mean, this is all, sort of fifth grade anthropology here, folks. But but one of the things that you need to do if you're going to have a division of labor is you need to keep records. You need data. Even, I mean, you're going to have to do something if you're going to have people dealing with agriculture and people dealing with defending the state, and only that, you still have to collect taxes, because the guys who are defending you are not planting seeds or collecting the harvest. So you need taxes. And once you need taxes, you need to keep records. You need to keep records not only for taxes, but you need to know how many different people you can call on from what village to come defend your fiefdom. You have an army, you need logistics. All of that requires records. I would think that literature, actually, written literature, came after the creation of bureaucracies writing things, because I mean, you could have Homer or pre-Homers reciting literature or poetry or Kalevala, but unless you get someone to write it down, it's going to disappear, and it only gets written down once you have something. You have an alphabet or some way of keeping records. And so actually you go and you probably most likely went and took what the bureaucrats were using to write down the words or create written language for what the poets were singing. But in any case, we get to a society where you have, with some kind of differentiation of labor, you have people who make your swords and your spears, you have your cooks who make food for the army, and you have shoemakers and you have doctors. And in order to do that, you need records, and you need people who can read and write records. With a bureaucracy, whether it's the scribe class 5,000 years ago in Egypt, or the mandarins, the sort of the civil servant class, in China 3,000-4,000 years ago, their job was to gather and record data. It could be grain harvests or number of able-bodied fighters in a village. You need to know what there was in your territory. And of course, you need to count taxes in order to pay your potential soldiers and the bureaucrats themselves who do the counting. So it's no wonder that the state emerged more or less at the same time, 3,000 or to 5,000 years ago in China, Mesopotamia, and also, in Egypt, but also later on in the Americas, where they basically appear in parallel with writing and record keeping. Indeed, we can posit it was record keeping necessary for the management of the proto-state that led to the development of writing, which we consider the hallmark of civilization. And for written literature, be it the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Analects of Confucius, you need first a written language to write down the oral literature, whether it's the Kalevala or Homer. So all developing states, all functioning states need to keep records. And for that, you need a bureaucracy and a set of people who track what's going on. Now, in order to understand how digitization can completely revolutionize this, is you need to understand that governance or the management of the state, whatever it is, the state as a city, the state as a village, or the state as an empire, has always been carried out by a bureaucracy, regardless of the medium, be it cuneiform on clay or sort of quill on paper, or the favorite of so-called modern governance, the PDF, which is not digitization, I would say, PDF. And so too also with the form, I mean, not only the medium, but, do you use PDF, do you use Excel tables, or do you use, sort of squared paper that you had in the 19th century? But the process of governance and restricted by these media, which are all basically the same, is that governance is a serial or sequential process. It could be an Egyptian scribe, a Roman tax official, a 19th century British clerk, as they pronounce clerk, or a Department of Motor Vehicles employee. They all have an office. They all have documents submitted to them. The employee, whoever it is, whatever level, scribe or clerk, takes a paper, enters the data by hand or by computer, and then sends it via interoffice mail, snail mail or email, or via a slave who will run from one end of Rome to the other end of Rome with a piece of papyrus. It's all a serial process. I mean, this is the bureaucracy since, in other words, since the beginning of the state till 2001 in Estonia. Bureaucracy has been one thing, being a document going from one place to another place where it's processed by someone else and maybe gets a stamp or maybe photocopied in later eras, put into a file cabinet, and then it's sent on, and then it goes to the next place, and it goes to the next place. In the United States, in what is called the interagency process for the State Department, there are up to 15 signatures that have to be given by different responsible offices of the Foreign Ministry before it will go to the president's office, where it will go through a similar series of vettings on the part of the National Security Council, and then it will be announced as policy by the president. That could be just one sentence in a speech, by the way, but nonetheless. The point is, it's from one place to another to another. It is in a sequence. This is called serial processing, S-E-R-I-A-L, not serial, C-E-R-E-A-L, as in your morning cornflakes, if you eat that, or pudru, if you eat that. That's porridge in Estonian. Now, nothing of this has changed. To see it at the human level, consider what happens when a child is born. First, you have to get a paper birth certificate. You may have to provide you probably do have to provide a marriage certificate to ensure that, at least in this country, the child carries the father's name. In many countries, including this one, you have to register the newborn as a resident. Once you do that, then with the birth certificate and having residence, you go and apply to get a doctor. You may need to apply to get social services. And then you need to go, if your country happens to offer it, but mine does, as do many other, to apply for paid leave. All of this is done from the citizen point of view in serial fashion. That is, you have to do it yourself. It was done by a series of government officials who would take time to do this, give the appropriate stamp or whatever needs to be done. And here again, it is no different from the experience of the citizen of most Western countries today, using PDFs, or the poor guy in Mesopotamia applying for sort of, I don't know, draft deferment. Governance has remained the same. So the question is, how do you do a digital democracy? You know that you have certain tools that previously did not exist. And that tool is parallel processing. This is not simply a matter of technology. The question is, how do you design your government so it can work in a parallel fashion, because this is a leap in technology that could not be done with material, meaning sort of physical records. You can, in fact, transfer things and perform many operations at the same time and result in much more efficient governance, and in fact, probably far more secure and private. And before I continue with that, let me just point out again that while people are obsessed with privacy and how bad digital governance is, I would argue that the way that actually it is precisely paper-based record keeping that is the most insecure, because there is no record of who looks at what and who has seen what or who has copied what. But in 2013, there was a Formula One racing car driver, Michael Schumacher, which may mean something to some people. I'm not a fan, but I don't even know what Formula One and Formula 4 is. But anyway, I know that there was this guy. But what happened to him was that he was the world's greatest racing car driver. And then he went skiing in Switzerland and he crashed into a tree and had a horrible accident, and he was laid out and he's never really recovered from it, though he fortunately did not die. Within a few hours of his being admitted to the hospital, Bild Zeitung, the largest yellow newspaper in Europe, or the largest circulation yellow newspaper, had pictures of his skull and the doctor's evaluation. It was all known to everybody. But you can design a system, as we have, that would be absolutely impossible. Yet, no matter how many times I explain this, people say, we cannot digitize governance because what about my healthcare records? They wouldn't be private. This is the argument that I get. Elise is looking at me very oddly, but this is the argument you get in most countries today when I talk about the digitization of healthcare, because that is the obsession. Whereas if you think about it, if you're a patient, what is it? Especially, I mean, when you have a high profile patient for whom there is very much interest, be it a president or a racing car driver or a pop star, your records are on paper, they're in a file cabinet. If someone goes into the file cabinet, opens it up, takes it out, wearing gloves, so no fingerprints, makes a photocopy and puts it back in the same place, no one will ever know until that information comes out that has even been looked at or copied. If it comes out, and there's a lot of, there's quite a bit of motivation, financial already, for that to happen, then it will come out. Yet people say, oh no, we can't do that. We can't do things electronically because we don't guarantee privacy. And this is where, this is a perfect example of where the governing elite, the politicians, not understanding the basics of even of digital tech, have not, or don't understand. And so you have, I mean, I've just been in too many debates with politicians in too many countries about this issue that I mean, basically I've gotten to the point where say, well, we'll just digitize, and if you don't want to do it, that's too bad, and you can stay in the 20th century. But the point is that this is where politics and tech run into each other, not only in terms of what, you know, the social media companies do, but if you don't understand this basic fact that in fact paper is not more secure, you're not going to be able to do much. So, but again, the idea, if you want to redo governance so that you can process things in parallel with all of the efficiencies that come out of it, you need to fundamentally accept that it is politically okay for us to do things digitally. Now, this gets then to the fundamental big problem of digitization, and that is trust. How do you build the trust in society that digitized governance is okay? This becomes a particular problem because you do not trust the government to do something digitally, yet you trust your data with all of your personal data to private companies that in fact monetize this. There's a big fat book. I don't know. You see it? I think it's unfortunately backwards, I guess, for you, but it is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and it's fat. And it's just full of information about how all of your data is monetized by social media companies. And we all go along. We just click the little button that says accept, be it on a newspaper or a magazine or whatever you do, thanks to GDPR, or when you accept the contract that you have, it is a contract with Facebook or Twitter, that they can use all your data. When it comes to the government, we don't do that at all. But people believe in paper. Paper proves something is real because paper is real. You get a receipt, you paid for something or you turned in something. In the government apparatus, you sign for a document, you sign off on a document. But we do not believe that in the digital world is private. Fundamentally, this is a psychological bias. And what you have to overcome is a psychological bias, because if you don't get that trust, which is a psychological concept, there will be no uptake by the population of digital governance. Trust is the sine qua non of digital governance. So what the task of government becomes providing trust, saying you can trust us, even though you don't trust government, which is kind of odd because it's about the only accountable thing there is in this world these days is your government. All right, so what gives trust? First and foremost, transparency. Long before we address the concrete issues of which technology to use, trust in digitization means above all that you as a citizen have to know who can look at your data, what is legitimate to look at, what is not legitimate to look at, and who in fact is looking at your data. That nota bene, I mean, what is important to note is that you do not have this with paper. There is no obligation for any government to show you who is looking at your papers. So we actually have an advantage in digitization, is that you can write into law and into the technology, the obligation for transparency. And I would say not only can you, but you must do it to get over this strange sort of understanding of paper versus digital as one thing being different from the other, and one being paper being better. You have to define, I mean, this is why digitization and governance is not just having, as one of our prime ministers said, you know, it's you go around and you go, here is digital card, here is AVR digital. All my data here. No, your data are not in here. This thing does not include your data. Sorry. You know, if anyone, I mean, I've had, you know, I hold my head when I've heard some of these talks in previous times. No, but what you do need is you have to create the trust by the architecture and design of the system to guarantee that only you and authorized people can see your data. And this is a task that you need. You don't, you know, if we started out with digital government and came out with paper, everyone would distrust paper for a very good reason. But unfortunately, since everyone's used to paper, we have to now spend the next 50 years creating trust in the in digital governance the way we have. I mean, which actually, it didn't take that long in Estonia. It took about, I guess, 10 years to get to the point where we were all willing to trust it. And once you start building this trust, you have the trust, then you can start, which you have accomplished by defining all these things as to who can see what. Then you can start getting into what is usually the first step in development of, I mean, in the development literature. I mean, you come out and say, you know, you're a developing country and they say you can digitize, and the first thing they do is buy a computer system, which usually on the advice of Deloitte or McKinsey saying, yeah, buy this, it'll be great, but without ever worrying about the trust and design problem. And this is, I mean, then you have to, when you design a system, and this, it's not merely a legal or regulatory issue. What is culturally acceptable, it also varies from country to country. A perfect example is transparency versus privacy of what is public data, what is not. In the second half of the first decade of this country, of the time we were in the EU, the man in charge of sort of transparency and corruption, Siim Kallas, our former prime minister, came up with this thing which is eminently reasonable to anyone living in Northern Europe, which is that that of the 40% of the almost 1 trillion euros that make up the EU budget, 40% goes to the common agricultural policy. So 400 billion euros goes to this over a 7-year period. And so Kallas said, well, you know, this is kind of weird. We don't know where this money is going. We should publish who gets what money. And this is completely normal in Estonia, Finland, Sweden, I don't know where else, but Northern Europe basically does this. And he said, okay, we need this transparency. We should, our fundamental principle is every penny of public money must be accounted for, and we must know where it's going. And so he pushed this through, and it became a regulation of the European Union. It was taken to court by the southern countries of the European Union, saying, this violates our privacy. That why should anyone know who gets what money from the EU? And in showing my bias, I'll say, even though it's not your money, but in any way. So they took this to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice said, yes, this is true. This violates your privacy. And so the European Court of Justice decided that those countries that wish to make public who gets what money, and those are Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and the UK, they can publish who gets what money from the EU, from the Common Agricultural Policy. But the countries that took the EU to court, Spain, France, Germany, and Italy, and I guess a whole host of others, they do not have to publish who gets what money. In the meantime, we did discover that instead of the rhetoric that you heard from these countries that, oh, we need CAP, so much money for CAP to pay for the little farmer in some little valley who produces this amazing cheese and has been doing it for 500 years, that actually the bulk of the money, 20, 30, 40 billion euros, went to agribusiness companies. Neste and Danone were the primary recipients of all of this money, but in any case, we no longer know that. We knew it around 2009, but no longer do we know who gets the money. So, but the point is, if you're going to digitize this, you have different countries have different things. Finland publishes everyone's income. Estonia does not do that, but Estonia publishes, as a public record, all of your property holdings.
Yeah.
I mentioned this to Greece, and they said, "What? How can you possibly do that?" I heard someone say something, and it seems.
Yeah, I think we are going towards the last 20 minutes. But yeah, please finish your thoughts, and then we start. Okay.
I'll continue next time on how you accomplish these things.
Okay,
so
great. Okay, so my AirPods already run out of juice, but still, I think we heard a very vast. Okay, so okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Good, perfect. So we heard a vast array of your lecture, where you started out with really going about why does the government actually have such a challenge to digitize, over the need to really also hold the social media accountable, and how we are actually also challenged by the need to actually being able to parallelize versus the old bureaucratic step-by-step digitization or processing of information of citizens. And so we actually received a number of questions already from the participants. But before we get to that, I wanted to know, I mean, given all these big challenges and discussions, is there hope? Is there hope?
Yes, there is. I just didn't get to it today.
Okay, great.
I'll leave you hanging. It's kind of like to be continued.
Okay, yeah, well, of course, we have more possibilities with that. I would like to start with the question from Alexandra. Maybe you want to mention it yourself, where you talk about big tech and liberal democracy. So you can just tune up your microphone and then go with the video. Alexandra, maybe you just put your question forward yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Mr. Ilves, so you mentioned that the big tech companies have grown on the basis of liberal democracy, but controversially, they also are destroying it right now with their current policies and actions. And do you think that the response to this issue is in liberal democracy, or does it lie in something else, something fundamentally different? And if the latter, then in what specifically? Thank you.
Well, I don't believe in, I mean, I do emotionally, philosophically, whatever, do not believe in an alternative to liberal democracy. So I would prefer a solution that follows the sort of the legislative principles of liberal democracy. I mean, in Russia, you put people in, they put a guy in jail, Mr. Smirnov, for liking a post on social media. I mean, I don't really think this is the way that most of people would like to go. So yes, we have to fix it ourselves. It grew out of the science and free inquiry that is enabled by the Enlightenment and we have the responsibility to maintain it. You would not have ever invented the internet in an authoritarian society. Never. You would have not invented a computer in an authoritarian society. In 1987, there was a trade fair in Paris showing personal computers. There was an Apple III there, which is a very primitive Apple, but it was 1987, and it sold for $3,000, roughly, which is a lot now. But there was a Russian one that was oddly enough called an apricot, and it did not work. The keys came out and it sold for $28,000. So that's communism versus liberal, democratic, regulated capitalism. No, so we cannot let it happen, is my point. We have to use the legal means available to us constitutionally as liberal democracies to ensure that we do not lose our fundamental rights and freedoms.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. I think continuing with the idea around big tech in the US, I think Wouter has a question that brings about why don't we have big tech in Europe? Wouter, please put your first question forward.
Yes, thank you very much. And first and foremost, thank you for this really interesting lecture. It has been fascinating.
Can you turn on your camera?
Unfortunately not, because my bandwidth doesn't allow it. I live right in front of the Alekak factory and I'm using my phone for internet. And the Alekak factory is blocking my upload speed. But in 2 weeks, I've moved out of here and then it will be possible. So stay tuned for that. My question concerns the centralization of tech unicorns in Silicon Valley. So the way I see it is that this is one of the US's greatest assets in the area of digitization, because the centralization of expertise and healthy competition allows these companies to bash heads with one another and grow very quickly. And in that same respect, for example, China has the city of Shenzhen, where similar developments are taking place. Now, I'm wondering, does the European Union have either the capacity, the will, or even the need to create a tech expertise area that could grow to a similarly prominent holdfast on disruptive technology creation and innovation?
Well, I mean, there are things you can do via legislation, but I think that the fundamental problem actually is cultural. And we see, I've known so many Estonian companies that have moved to Europe, from Europe to the US for something that has nothing to do with law. It is the nature of investment. 80% of investment in Europe is from banks and 20% from private equity. In the US, it's the opposite. And to think of what the difference is, can you imagine you're this guy in 1976 and he stated he does not believe in bathing and he hasn't cut his hair. And he walks into Deutsche Bank and he says, I have this thing that my friend has the same first name as me, Steve, that we've developed in my garage. Now, how many seconds before the security guards throw this guy, oh, and then he also says, and I want to call it an Apple, I think, and it's a computer. How many seconds before the security guard in Deutsche Bank throws him out? I mean, that is the problem. You can get a loan or an investment from a bank if you're 45 years old or more, have never gone bankrupt, and you have your own house, and then maybe they'll think about it. On the other hand, if you go to Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, you say, I had this weird idea. I don't know. What do you think? And they'll say, we'll have our team look at it. And then they say, okay, we think you're fine. Here, we'll give you, we'll invest $300 million in your little company. I know there's a guy I know who's, I first, because I was, of course, I mean, being the way I was, kind of weird, but I mean, when I saw this kid at Tallinn Tech had gotten 200,000 euros as an investment for an idea of his. And so I invited him. I said, this is really cool. Guy's 22 and he's got, $200,000 for his little startup. So I invited him in to come see me, and we drank tea. And then he said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. President, that in 2 weeks, I'm moving to the United States. I said, why are you doing that? He said, well, first of all, I mean, the market here is terrible, but more importantly, they actually invest there. There's no way to be invested in here. And so he moved to the US. 6 months later, he had gotten, I don't know, what it was. He had gotten, I guess, $2 million in investment. And in another 2 years, he had $6 million. And another 2 years later, he sold his company for about $100 million. This is what happens when you actually have a favorable investment climate. But that's a cultural matter. I mean, Europeans have not sufficiently developed private equity the way you have in the United States, and the way you have, by the way, in the UK. UK is not as good as the United States, but that's another place that creative people move to. I mean, that's I think the fundamental fundamental block to developing the way the US has. Chinese, they just throw money at you if you think if your company will go somewhere, but they maintain control. So I mean, that's it's a slight problem in my mind. So those, I think, are the major problems. There's no reason why. I mean, if you look at how many people from Europe have done creative things, then there is no reason in IT, but mainly in the United States, there's no reason to think that Europe can't do the same, except for the culture. There is one other slight thing which has to do with the bureaucracy of the EU, which is that if you apply for funding from the European Commission in kind of like in the field of IT, the way it works runs counter to the nature of innovation. Because I mean, you have an idea, you start doing something one way, then you suddenly discover actually this thing you've been doing actually solves a completely different problem, and then you switch over to that, and then you keep developing that until it goes somewhere. With the way the EU funding has been set up, if you change your project in any way, you have to give the money back. So it really, and so most IT companies I know say we don't deal with the commission. That's pointless because the way we invent things just doesn't go that way. Innovation does not go in a single straight line where you want to get there from here and this is what will work. Instead, you may discover, I mean, it's like penicillin, right? I mean, you're looking at bacteria and something in bacteria, and then you accidentally get a mold growing in your petri dish, and you discover that the mold is killing the bacteria, and you realize this is how we fight bacteria, right? But if you had EU funding for that, they'd say, screw you.
Nice insight on we could go on about research funding. I think that's going to be really a nice discussion for another time. I think we have another question from Josh Smith, who talks about the difference between tech and governance, how to overcome it. Josh, you want to put it forward yourself?
Yes, I'll do that. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Josh. I'm one of the 14 of us that's in the Democracy and Governance program, or now renamed Politics and Governance in the Digital Age. But my question is, what do you think the best way to overcome this divide that you were talking about between technology and governance is? Think it could be partially overcome if more politicians had a technical background? And is there a way that the government could encourage people from technical backgrounds to become in decision-making capacities?
Well, it's very hard to force people to do anything, though I would certainly, and have for decades, stress the importance of science education for everyone. That the idea that you can stop studying mathematics at arithmetic is, I mean, just anathema. And I think that, well, I have a bizarre perspective, though. In fact, it probably does account for much of my problem, as it were, which is that I went to a university which was already then, 45 years ago, the last university in the United States that required everyone to take a science course and required all the engineers to take courses in the history of political philosophy as well as in literature. You couldn't escape it. I mean, not everyone liked it, but the point is that that used to be the norm, or at least in most decent universities. But by 1972, there were 2 universities that still did this. One of them was mine. It was also one of the reasons I went there, because I could never decide if I wanted to do sort of the soft stuff or the hard stuff. They were both equally appealing to me. But I think the problem is we need to rethink our tertiary education as well as secondary, that people do get both the math side, the STEM side of things, at least at some level, to understand what's going on, as well as you do need to get the fundamental philosophical issues that we have encountered, beginning with Plato and Aristotle, running through Cicero and up to the Enlightenment. There's been too little improvement since the Enlightenment, but at least up to, say, John Stuart Mill, that would be good.
Great. Thank you. Lisa, maybe for concluding question.
Yes, thank you very much. It's actually quite related to Josh's question and what you just said. Just asking it from the perspective of our students, a question that our students might be interested in. So what do you think our current students of politics and governance should do or keep in mind or focus on to make sure that they will be those kinds of future policymakers or the new political elite that understands tech, that doesn't have the technological ignorance? Do you have any practical advice, perhaps?
In 1994-95, I got 2 Tartu University professors Fulbright fellowships to come to Columbia University to look at the program that requires everyone to get it. This went on to more Fulbright money to send to Tartu a person from Columbia to help set up this program. And basically, the people at the time thought this was so terrible that they killed it. So that was, 25 years ago. What can you do? I don't know. I think there's a different view of this, because one of the professors actually was when I got together with them after they had done this course, or teaching this course at Columbia, said, "Oh my God, can you imagine the students discuss these books?" And I said, "Well, how do you do it?" Said, "Well, the professor comes in, and then the student comes and writes down what the professor says, and then he takes an exam." And I said, "You don't read the books?" "No, I tell them what's in the books." So I don't know. I mean, I would say do that program. I mean, the way it worked, or something like it, but basically, it's a lot of work. The week 1 and 2, you read the Republic. Week 3 and 4, you read the Politics. And then you move on to, I don't know what else you moved on to, but anyway, slowly you get up to the end of the Enlightenment. And then at the last serious book we read was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but this was 45 years ago. I don't know what they read today. We also read Mao and Lenin, by the way, as well. But yeah, that wasn't, suddenly realized that neither Mao nor Lenin are very smart after you've been reading, you know, John Locke or something.
So thank you for all of this. I think we already got a nice overview of what you will be talking about also in the coming lectures, right? I mean, particularly when you already started talking about the threats to democracy, which will be the topic of your next lecture on the 17th of March. Is there anything you want to send to our participants to think about until the next month in order to prepare for your lecture?
Well, I'm kind of drained at the moment, but what I'll do is send you, Robert, some suggested readings, and then you can distribute them.
We'll do that.
But just, I mean, what you can do certainly is look at, I mean, if you're really interested, is Google The Two Cultures by C.P. Snow.
Yeah.
C.Snow.
I'm sure that.
Read the first half. I mean, the second half, he just goes off. I mean, it's very 1959 and looking at Soviet education versus, you know, U.S. education or British education. It's really kind of, but the fundamental problem he describes there very nicely. And it's just that it's gotten so much worse.
Thank you for these great insights. So we had a revealing 2 hours, and we're gonna have a fantastic one in 1 month again. So stay tuned, so to speak, until the 17th of March, again at 10:15 Eastern European time, whatever that translates to from where you are watching us, whether you're with the politics and governance program here at University of Tartu, or you're joining in from the US, from Israel, from other countries. Looking forward to having you again. Thanks so much. Yes, please.
I would say, in case there are questions that, at least regarding reading, you can send them to Jak Erik Laya.
Yes, we'll have all of that here, and then.
And so you can pass them on. I mean, don't expect essay-long answers to your questions, but I could certainly perhaps offer some things to read about if you're interested.
Great, thank you. The Jak Erik was the one that had organized the Zoom call, so you should all have his email address from the registration page. Thank you.